Today we're going to look at the book of Genesis. This lecture is going to be strictly audio. I'm going to look at the book as a whole, so an overview of the book and some of the individual parts that go along with the book, background, other information that I think is pertinent to understanding the book overall. First of all, we have to come to the realization of the meaning of the name of the book. And Genesis, at its core, is about beginnings. This is where we get the word Genesis. It is the beginning. And so this is the foundational story upon which the redemptive plan of God is going to be orchestrated. So this is the beginning information. Really, if you want to look at it, it's the background information that you need to understand in order to understand the great redemptive work of God. So it covers the origin of the universe. It covers the beginning of humanity. It covers how sin came into the world and what the early effects of sin were. And it focuses in on God's chosen people, Israel. And so the book sets the stage for God's covenant relationship with his people as it reveals his sovereignty in creation and history. So that's really a very quick understanding of what we're going to get into when we get into the book of Genesis. So what is it about? Well, I told you it's the foundation of the redemptive work of God and how this all came into being. So it's telling the story, the early on story, and it is largely narrative. And I'll talk about literary genre at some point in this lecture. But as we look at the Bible itself, the first 5 books of the Bible, particularly in the area of the Christian Bible, are referred to as the Pentateuch. Jews would refer to it as the Torah. So when we're talking about Genesis as part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we're talking about those books which are written by Moses. And Genesis itself is biblical narrative. So it is telling the story. It's providing a historical foundation for the entirety of the Bible, really, and a theological foundation for understanding many aspects of theology, primarily who God is, who we are, and how we relate to God in the creation that he has made. So it's moving from the creation of the world, Genesis is, to the establishment of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. But what about the structure of the book in regard to the chapters and what those chapters are primarily focused on? Well, you can look at the book of Genesis being divided up in 3 main parts. Chapters 1 through 11 would give us the primordial history. That's dealing with creation, fall, flood, the Tower of Babel. And then you have the patriarchal narratives in the middle of the literary structure of the book of Genesis, which deal with Genesis 12 through 36, those chapters. And these are the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of the people of what will be ultimately Israel. And then the last portion of the book of Genesis, you have Joseph's story from Genesis 37 through 50. And really in this, you see the providence of God through Joseph's life and the preservation of Joseph's life and the preservation of a people and his lineage, in which he's promised already to Abraham that he would make his descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So that providential work of God through the life of Joseph is what we find there at the end. So that's a threefold structure, three main parts of the book of Genesis that we can see telling the story, and that's the large way in which these things are divided. Now, within the divisions, you see even more structure. So Genesis 1 and 2 is going to provide you with a creation order. So this is a good and orderly creation that God has made, how he creates the world and how he creates human beings and appoints them to be his image bearers and to rule and to steward the creation which he has created. But then in Genesis 3, you see humanity disobey God, bringing about sin, death, and separation from him there in the Garden of Eden, and then God judging the situation and putting Adam and Eve out of the garden as part of the punishment in which he would lay down upon them because of their sin of disobedience against God. So you have that early structure, and then you have more structure in the cycle of sin and grace that takes place. It's a repeated pattern which emerges throughout the book of Genesis. You have the sin of humanity rebelling against God. You have God judging in discipline for sin, because of sin, and then God showing grace and mercy as he preserves his plans. And so examples of that would be in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve rebelling against God, and then as a result of their sin, their offspring, Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel. Then God judges later on with Noah building an ark, the flood being brought by God, God judging the earth, and then even after that, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, and God separating the people and spreading them all over the earth rather than having them work together in that situation and ultimately suppress God and truth and do all the things that they were ultimately going to do and did at that time for which God judged them. And so you have that early on, this cycle of sin and grace and God being merciful and yet judging. You know, this will play on later on in the book of Judges and those sin cycles that takes place there. The people rebel against God. God allows other nations to come in and oppress them, and they cry out to God, and God hears their cry, sends the judge, and they throw off the chains of whatever nation at that time that is oppressing them, or whatever people are oppressing them, and then they go back to doing exactly what they were doing before they were oppressed. And God judges again, allows again for them to fall into their sin, which leads them through cycle after cycle after cycle of that going on. Much like what's going on here in a smaller scale, the presentation of what is taking place. Then when you get to the middle of the literary structure, the full story emerges, and it's Genesis 12 through 25, and the story of Abraham. And this story begins with the call of Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and God is calling him to a country, him being Abraham, to a country that is not his, he has not seen, does not know about, and for his obedience, God would bless him and make him a great nation, even though he and his wife were unable to conceive a child for a long period of time, and he was already old, already up in years. But God chose Abraham for this very special purpose. And so when we talk about Abrahamic religion, we talk about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all those being Abrahamic. And so this is where we see the narrative of Abraham, and these three religions will be based largely on Abraham, and they will be descended from Abraham, and God would work through this one individual to achieve his ultimate plan and purpose. But God promises a land, he promises descendants, he promises blessing to all nations through Abraham. And it's Abraham's faith is tested repeatedly. And the culmination of that test happens on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, and where he demonstrates his trust in God's promise. And that was the fact that God gave Isaac to him, and then God told him to sacrifice his son. There's a lot of discussion around this being a type or a picture of what God ultimately does in Jesus Christ, sacrificing his son. Really, this, you could look at it that way. You could look at it multiple ways, but it's a testing of Abraham's faith as to whether or not he would be willing to sacrifice his son, even if God asks him. And of course, he passes the test. God provides the sacrifice that is not Isaac, and we go forth from there. And many have argued that it does foreshadow Christ's ultimate sacrifice and showing the faith that rests on God's faithfulness. And as we look at the patriarchal period, the patriarchal point, we go from the patriarch, that is Abraham, to the other patriarchs who would follow, and that would be Isaac, who the covenant is continued through, and he is giving blessing by God, although it's rather quiet, but it's a stability and faithfulness that is represented here. And then Jacob, the offspring of Isaac, there is that great story of the blessing. Jacob is not the firstborn son, but Jacob ultimately becomes the favored son, based a lot on the fact that his mother is who she is. But God chooses for different ways. In that context, and in many contexts later, it was always the eldest son who would carry on the birthright, who would carry on the name, who would be the one who would be the one through whom all these things would come. So rather than Ishmael, Esau in this case, rather than Esau, it is Jacob. And Jacob begins, as a deceiver, but he transforms ultimately through divine encounters, and he becomes the man that God would use. He wrestles with God. You see this in Genesis 32, as symbolizing, in some ways, you could take it as a symbol, symbolizing a spiritual struggle and a transformation. But ultimately, after that, he is renamed. He's renamed Israel, and it's going to be through his 12 sons that the 12 tribes of Israel are named, and the covenant promise is continued through him. And so you have the working of God going through Jacob and his sons. And one of his sons, God uses in a particularly powerful way, is Joseph. And this, of course, is the third main part of the book of Genesis. And you have Genesis 37 through 50, and it's the story of Joseph and how God demonstrates his sovereignty in using human evil for divine good. You know, you even have that great statement by Joseph later on in Genesis 50, verse 20, you meant evil against me, or what you meant for evil, God meant it for good. And so there is a great providence that takes place, and there is a showing of God's providence in what happens, even though there's dark events and there's betrayal, there's suffering, there's struggle, there's imprisonment. But ultimately, God uses those difficult times to make Joseph into the man he's going to be the prime minister in Egypt, to see what he needs to see, to have the ability to be able to do what he does in order to make him who he needs to be in order to be used for deliverance of the people, the protection of God's people in Egypt, because there's famine everywhere else. But God has providentially worked through Joseph in Egypt to make sure there's no famine in Egypt. Okay, so looking at other aspects of the book of Genesis, we have what we have traditionally thought to be the authorship of the book, and that authorship is through Moses. Moses is looking back, telling the story of the redemptive history of God, how God has worked through, and he's documenting this. He's telling the story of the beginning of it all and how God has worked through the patriarchs. So Moses, it is thought, is the author, not only of the author of the book of Genesis, but the other early five books, first five books, the Pentateuch. Moses authors these. Now, always that question, and when we talk about the book of Deuteronomy, we'll talk about this. The end of the book of Deuteronomy ends with Moses dying. Well, obviously, Moses couldn't write about his own death. So it is most likely in that case that it is picked up by the next leader of Israel, Joshua. And Joshua writes about the death of Moses. But all of these five books, primarily the authorship is Moses, through whom these things are written. Now, dates, those are things that are a little bit harder to nail down. You're talking about events that happen many hundreds of years. It may be 1,800 years. It may be anywhere from 1,800 to 1,300 years before Christ. So a lot of this is pointing to different time periods, and so I'm not going to put an exact date on it. But if you feel you need an exact date, you can always look it up and see. I'm just trying to give a general overview of the book and those things which go around it. As far as the literary genre of the book of Genesis, it is a historical narrative. You could say Old Testament historical narrative. Primarily, when we think about Old Testament historical narrative, we're thinking about the books of Joshua through Second Chronicles or Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. We're looking at that large historical narrative portion of the Bible. But Genesis is a narrative, a historical narrative, an Old Testament historical narrative. And it's telling the story. So it's not intended to be any kind of scientific manual to discuss the creation of the world. It's not used to formulate major issues as far as it's not an ethical treatise, although there is ethics to it, but it's really meant to tell the story, and it is used for a theological purpose. So I don't want to denigrate that, but its ultimate intent is to be a revelation of God, His character and purpose, to account for creation, and to reveal the who which created and the why, but not necessarily the how. So this narrative, it narrows from the universal history of creation into a specific redemptive purpose through which God has chosen Abraham. So that is the purpose behind it, and it's written as a narrative. So it being written as a narrative, you should know how to treat it. It's a story, but more than a story, because it is the Bible, after all. Now, as far as the connection of Genesis to what's going to take place later on, i.e., the gospel with Jesus. So Genesis is anticipating the gospel of Christ because it tells the story of why Christ is needed to begin with. See, Adam is this first figure God creates, but Adam fails. And even as the Bible will speak of it, again, the second Adam, Jesus, he does not fail. He succeeds, he obeys, whereas Adam disobeyed. So in that, there's a connection between the first Adam and the second Adam, if you want to state it that way, and that Adam himself failed, but Christ did not fail. Christ succeeded. And therefore, there is that connection to Christ. I mean, you would not know if you were just walking, you would pick up the New Testament, okay, and you begin reading in Matthew 1. Well, you would know about who Jesus is, but unless you dive into the full story of why it was necessary for Jesus to die, then you wouldn't fully understand the full picture of God's redemptive work. Why would there need to be a redemptive work? Well, Genesis tells you there needs to be a redemptive work because of what took place in the garden and the separation between God and man and the God-man ultimately coming, and the God-man being Jesus Christ. So that way you know, and Genesis tells you of the need for a Savior. Genesis also outlines the promise that God made through Abraham, and that one day a promised seed would come through whom all the nations would be blessed. That term seed has been studied and discussed many different ways. You could read commentaries. Does he mean the people Israel? Does it mean one? If you take it to mean one, the seed of Abraham, and that would be the connection to Jesus. Later on, the New Testament picks that idea up in Galatians 3:16, that seed of Abraham being Jesus Christ. So the promise made to Abraham ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That is the story. And then there is the element of typology. And if you ever dove into that, and that's where you go back and you look into the Old Testament and you see types of Christ in the Old Testament. There was a guy very well known in evangelical circles in the 1900s, the 20th century. We're living in the 21st century, okay. 20th century. A commentator, his name is Arthur Pink. And Arthur Pink, it was kind of joked at times, Arthur Pink could roll over a stone in the Old Testament and find Jesus. I don't necessarily think you could do that, but sometimes typology does that. Meaning, they'll look at someone in the Old Testament and say, well, this person is a type of Christ. What often baffles me personally is when that mantle is put on certain people, like Samuel. Yes, he began to deliver, not Samuel, Solomon. No, Samson. I'll get the S right at some point. But Samson, he begins to deliver the people of Israel the hands of the Philistines. But when you look at the character of who he is, the only thing I could connect him to Jesus with is the fact that he's a deliverer. Everything else, I can't do that. But Genesis offers a type. And that type is seen in Joseph. The story of Joseph and his suffering and what he went through. And then the ultimate triumphal ending, really, to the book of Genesis, and God using Joseph and the connection back to his family and all that takes place there. It foreshadows, some ways, the suffering, the exaltation, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, like I said, there's certain people that you could go back into the Old Testament and use a little bit of typology with. Joseph is one of those people. But ultimately, how are we to understand Genesis? Genesis really just lays the groundwork for the understanding of why there needs to be a Savior to begin with, and what kind of Savior there need to be. And that Savior ultimately appears in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. As far as key themes in the book of Genesis, that overall creation, fall, covenant, providence, promise. Creation, and that God is the one who created all things, and he is sovereign over all things. Fall, that sin corrupted creation. It separates man from God. The covenant, God initiating this redemption to the promise to Abraham and to his people, that he would redeem. His providence, as seen through the life of Joseph, that God sovereignly directs these events for his purpose and his plan, and the promise that ultimately he will make Abraham and his descendants and his seed the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the redemptive hope of all the world. And so, if we could summarize in a statement, Genesis reveals the God of creation, covenant and redemption, and he brings order from chaos and grace from sin. And that is a summation of the book of Genesis. Thank you.